The air was thick with tension before a single word was spoken. Then it happened. Kamala Harris, usually composed and measured, let her frustrations spill out in an unguarded burst. Her voice sharpened, the smile fell away, and the entire room recoiled. It was the kind of snap you expect behind closed doors, not under the bright lights of a stage watched by millions. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, pens freezing mid-sentence. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, lingering on Harris's flushed expression, as though trying to capture the exact instant dignity gave way to anger. And across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, still unmoved, calm in the storm. While Harris gestured furiously, Crockett leaned forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to expose. The contrast was stark, almost cinematic, the establishment voice unraveling against the unflinching gaze of a challenger who knew her worth. Viewers at home felt the energy shift instantly. Social feeds lit up in real time. Did Kamala really just lose it on live TV? Crockett hasn't even spoken yet and she's already won the moment? Hashtags began to form like sparks on dry grass, the firestorm just waiting for oxygen narrators. Of history will tell you, there are nights when words become more than words. When a single moment breaks the script and writes a new one. This was that night. Harris's eruption was not simply a slip, was a revelation. A glimpse of the fragility beneath the polished exterior, and in that instant Crockett became more than a participant. She became the mirror, reflecting arrogance back at its source. You could feel it in the silence that followed. A hush so complete, so charged, that even those rooting for Harris felt a shiver. The silence wasn't empty, it was anticipation. Hey, what would Crockett do? Would she fold under pressure, or rise with the weight of the nation watching? This wasn't just another debate moment. This was dignity colliding with arrogance. Against chaos. Identity and truth staring down the machinery of power. Every eye in the country was locked on the woman who hadn't even spoken yet. But this was only the beginning, because what Crockett said next would echo far beyond the room. Asterisk, the days leading up to the debate were painted with inevitability. Commentators filled television panels with predictions, almost all tilting in the same direction. Kamala Harris, the seasoned politician, the polished speaker, the establishment's favorite, was expected to glide across the stage with ease. She was touted as the unstoppable force, a veteran who had weathered storms, was more than capable of brushing off yet another challenger. Headlines declared it with certainty. Harris set to dominate debate. Editorials framed the night as a mere formality. She was the gladiator who had already been crowned before stepping into the arena, and yet that certainty carried with it a quiet arrogance. The assumption that the hierarchy was fixed, that power remained in the hands of those who had always claimed it, that challengers could be dismissed before the first word left their lips. Jasmine Crockett knew what it meant to walk into a room where no one expected you to belong. She had lived her life in those spaces, rooms where pedigree was valued over principle, where appearance outweighed authenticity. To the press, she was a footnote in the night's coverage, the underdog at best, the token opposition at worst. The story had already been written. Harris would rise. Crockett would stumble. And the balance of power would remain untouched. But history has a cruel way of humbling certainty. In the hours before the debate, as cameras captured Harris entering, with her entourage and the press buzzed like bees around her, Crockett's arrival went almost unnoticed. No flashing lights, no swarm of microphones, just a woman with purpose in her stride and conviction in her eyes. The juxtaposition was almost poetic. The spectacle of power on one side, the quiet resolve of dignity on the other. Inside the debate hall, the audience buzzed with anticipation. Harris supporters spoke in confident tones as though the outcome had already been decided, but among the crowd were voices often ignored, immigrants who had built their lives from scratch, young progressives searching for authenticity, communities long overlooked by political elites. They carried with them a hope, fragile yet unshaken, that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. The stakes were higher than headlines suggested. This wasn't simply about Harris versus Crockett. It was about whether dignity could triumph over dismissal, whether the calm voice of truth could pierce through the noise of power. It was about identity, belonging, and the soul of a country that still wrestled with who gets to be heard and who gets silenced. For Harris, the debate was another performance, another opportunity to reinforce her status. For Crockett, it was nothing less than a proving ground, a chance to stand not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told to wait their turn. And as the moderators took their seats, as the cameras Panned across the stage, there was a feeling that hung heavier than expectation, was possibility. The possibility that the script everyone thought they knew might crumble before their eyes, because the truth about gladiator arenas is simple. Crowns mean nothing when the fight begins. And while Harris entered the stage as the presumed victor, Crockett entered with something far more dangerous, nothing to lose, and everything to reveal. Everyone thought they knew how this night would go. But history had other plans. Asterisk. For years, Kamala Harris carried herself as though the stage belonged to her, and in many ways it did. She was the product of a long political climb, one paved with careful calculation, sharpened ambition, and the confidence of someone who had been told time and again that she was destined for the spotlight. She walked with the poise of power, her words delivered with practiced cadence, her expressions honed to fit the demands of the camera. To supporters, this was experience. To critics, it was performance. Her rise was not without controversy. Remembered her time as a prosecutor, those years when she built her reputation on being tough on crime. In the headlines, it played well. It framed her as serious, as unflinching. But for communities most affected by systemic injustice, her record told another story. To them, Harris was a figure who had spoken about reform while presiding over policies that reinforced inequities. She could smile warmly while brushing off painful truths. She could nod sympathetically while pivoting back to scripted lines. It was this ability, this almost reflexive dismissal, that became her signature on debate stages. Watch closely, and you could see it in the slight arch of her eyebrow. The carefully timed chuckle, the habit of cutting off an opponent not with evidence, but with tone. It wasn't the content of her rebuttals that silenced others. It was the way she conveyed, with every gesture, "I know better than you." The public saw glimpses of it before. During her presidential campaign debates, she thrived on moments where she could dismantle an opponent with sharp, clipped delivery. But the longer she spoke, the more a pattern emerged. Her words weren't built to connect, they were built to dominate. Critics began to notice the distance, the gap between polished lines and authentic conviction. She didn't simply debate, she talked down. For a time, this strategy worked. The media amplified her zingers, her base cheered her assertiveness, and opponents shrank under the weight of her presence. But power has a way of feeding itself, of creating an echo chamber so loud that outside voices become background noise. With every victory, with every headline that framed her as unbeatable, Harris grew more certain of her own invincibility. Confidence hardened into arrogance, and arrogance is a dangerous armor. It blinds you to subtlety, to nuance, to the quiet strength of those who don't match your volume but surpass your conviction. Harris entered this debate carrying that armor, polished to a shine, convinced that Crockett would be just another name added to her list of dispatched opponents. She underestimated the stage she was walking onto, not the lights, not the cameras, but the audience itself. Because while Harris had mastered the art of the political performance, the country had grown weary of performance without substance. Voters no longer craved the perfectly rehearsed soundbite. They longed for voices that reflected their struggles, their frustrations, their humanity. In her certainty, Harris failed to notice that the ground beneath her had shifted. The irony was sharp. The very traits that had once elevated her were now the ones dragging her down. Her polish felt like distance. Her dismissiveness felt like disrespect. The confidence that once drew admiration now invited resentment. Every smirk, every cutting interruption, every dismissive wave of the hand painted her not as the strong leader she believed herself to be, but as the embodiment of an elite class detached from the lives of ordinary people. And yet, as the debate began, Harris leaned fully into that persona. She smiled tightly, interrupted freely, and delivered her words with the same sharp cadence that once won her praise. But something was different now. The audience wasn't leaning in, they were pulling back. Every time she dismissed Crockett with a half laugh or a cutting remark, the tension grew thicker. We could sense the crowd's unease, the collective recognition that what they were witnessing wasn't strength, it was fragility disguised as control. Narrators of history often speak of hubris, the tragic flaw that undoes even the most powerful. For Harris, hubris was her belief that her polish was enough, that her image could shield her from scrutiny, that her tone could outweigh her substance. She believed herself untouchable. But arrogance carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. Because arrogance has a fatal flaw. It underestimates the strength of quiet resolve. Asterisk Jasmine Crockett did not arrive on that debate stage with the armor of entitlement or the glow of preordained power. She came carrying something heavier, her story, a story forged in the quiet corners of sacrifice. in the unglamorous grind of work that rarely makes headlines, but shapes character all the same. Born into a community that knew the sting of being underestimated, Crockett grew up watching how dignity could be maintained even in the face of systemic neglect. Her family's lessons were not about how to command cameras, but about how to carry yourself when no one is watching. They taught her that pride wasn't found in the titles before your name, but in the integrity behind your actions. Long before she stood beneath the blinding lights of national politics, Crockett was a defender in the trenches. As a lawyer, she spent countless hours representing those who could not afford justice. These weren't glamorous cases, they were messy, heartbreaking, and often thankless. She faced down prosecutors who dismissed her, judges who doubted her, and systems that seemed engineered to crush the very people she was fighting for. But with every client who walked away with hope instead of despair, she earned a deeper currency than prestige: trust. Her path into politics was not born from ambition alone, but from frustration at watching policy fail, the very community she had spent her career serving. She knew that winning one case at a time was not enough if the system itself remained stacked against the vulnerable. Entering politics was not about chasing the spotlight. It was about widening the circle of justice, about giving voice to those who had been systematically muted. Yet stepping into that world meant stepping into a gauntlet. Crockett was underestimated at every turn. She wasn't backed by dynasties or fortified by old money. She wasn't polished by the machinery of political grooming. Her power was raw, her presence unfiltered. And that unsettled the establishment. They dismissed her sharpness as inexperience, her passion as volatility, her truth-telling as naivete. But each dismissal only added fuel to her resolve. What set her apart was not perfection but authenticity. She did not speak in rehearsed sound bites, designed to trend for 24 hours. She spoke in the language of lived experience, the language of families working 2 jobs, students drowning in debt, of immigrants carving out lives against impossible odds. Every time she stood at a microphone, those who had been ignored could hear themselves in her cadence. And for many, that was a revelation. Crockett carried the scars of public service late nights away from family. Relentless criticism from opponents, and the weight of carrying communities on her shoulders. She knew the loneliness of walking into rooms where she was the only one who looked like her, spoke like her, or thought like her. But she never allowed that isolation to bend her. Instead, it became her foundation. She learned how to root herself deeply enough that no gust of dismissal could topple her. Her battles weren't only political, they were deeply personal. Each attack against her identity, her womanhood, her authenticity was meant to push her back into silence. But Crockett refused silence. She understood that silence was the ally of arrogance, and that to withhold truth in order to remain comfortable was to betray those who needed her most. This resilience, born of struggle and sharpened in the fires of underestimation, was invisible to many who only saw the headlines. But it lived in her voice, in the calm way she stood her ground when others expected her to flinch. It lived in the respect she commanded, not through titles, but through persistence. The night of the debate, all of these layers of her journey converged into her presence. She didn't walk onto the stage as a political celebrity. She walked on as the living embodiment of grit and dignity. While Harris's entry was adorned with pomp and expectation, Crockett's was quiet but seismic. She carried with her the weight of those who had been told they were too small, too late, too different to matter, and yet she did not carry bitterness. Crockett's story was not one of vengeance, but of vindication. She was not there to destroy her opponent. She was there to affirm the truth that dignity, when paired with courage, could not be dismissed. Her calmness in the face of Harris's eruption was not an act tit, was muscle memory. Forged from years of enduring storms without losing her center, those who underestimated her mistook humility for weakness. But humility in Crockett's hands was not a posture of submission, it was a weapon of clarity. It allowed her to listen when others shouted, to remain steady when others stumbled, to hold dignity as her anchor while others flailed. The irony of the debate was this: while Harris represented the establishment's idea of power, Crockett represented the people's definition of it. Power not as performance, but as presence. Not as arrogance, but as authenticity. And on this night, those years of grit would converge into a single moment of destiny. Asterisk. The opening exchanges began like any other debate: clipped answers, rehearsed lines, the expected parry and thrust of political theater. But it didn't take long for the rhythm to shift. Kamala Harris, eager to reassert control after her earlier eruption, leaned hard into her old habits. She cut across Crockett mid-sentence, her words sharp and dismissive, her tone designed not to engage but to dominate. Silence. The audience stirred, a few groans audible even before she finished her thought. But Crockett did not flinch. She simply paused, let Harris finish, then returned to her point as if the interruption were nothing more than a gust of wind. That calmness, that refusal to be rattled, was its own kind of defiance. And Harris felt it. With each interruption, she grew sharper, her interjections more barbed. She accused Crockett of oversimplifying, of misunderstanding, even of grandstanding. Each accusation landed like a strike in a duel meant to knock her opponent off balance. But Crockett absorbed them without blinking. Her composure became her weapon. When Harris interrupted again, this time with a chuckle, dripping with condescension, Crockett tilted her head slightly, met her opponent's eyes and said nothing until the moderator restored her time. The audience leaned forward, sensing the tension thickening, the battle lines hardening. Every duel has a rhythm, and by now the rhythm was unmistakable. Harris swung harder with every word, trying to overwhelm. Crockett countered by standing still, letting the force of Harris's blows reveal their own emptiness. The effect was subtle but devastating. The more Harris tried to assert dominance, the more the audience began to see desperation rather than strength. Social media flared in real time. Tweets captured the energy. Why does Harris keep cutting her off? Crockett's calm is making Harris look frantic. The debate was no longer just about policy. It had become a contest of character, of composure under pressure. And Crockett was quietly winning. As the exchange wore on, the tension escalated. Harris's voice rose. Her gestures grew sharper, her frustration more visible. She framed Crockett as naive, inexperienced, unprepared for the weight of leadership. You don't understand how this works, she said, her tone dripping with superiority, but the audience had heard enough. Murmurs spread. A woman in the front row shook her head. The room was shifting, its energy pulling away from Harris and toward the woman she had so confidently dismissed. And then came the moment that froze the air. Harris launched into yet another interruption, her words spilling fast, layered with disdain. She expected Crockett to fold, to stumble, to retreat. Instead, Crockett remained perfectly still, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She let Harris finish her tirade without so much as a twitch. And when the moderator turned back to her, she leaned forward, her voice low, deliberate, measured. Are you finished? The words weren't shouted. They weren't rehearsed. They were delivered with the calm authority of someone who knew the power of restraint. The audience erupted in laughter, in applause, in release. It wasn't just a reply, it was a turning of the tide. Harris blinked, visibly thrown. For the first time all night, she hesitated. And in that hesitation, Crockett seized the stage not with volume, not with spectacle, but with presence. The duel had shifted. Every word was no longer Harris's weapon. It was her liability. Every interruption now revealed her insecurity. And every measured response from Crockett elevated her further, painting her not as the underdog but as the steady center of the storm. The tension had built like a slow burn, each exchange another layer of heat. The insults, the interruptions, the disdain, all designed to shake Crockett, had instead exposed Harris, and the audience knew it. You could see it in their faces, hear it in their applause, feel it in the electricity running through the room. But no one expected Crockett's.com reply to flip the entire room upside down. Asterisk. Silence can be louder than shouting. For a moment after Harris's flurry of interruptions and condescension, the hall was suspended in itan, almost unbearable stillness. Camera zoomed in on Crockett's face, her expression steady, her eyes fixed on her opponent. She took a breath, the kind that feels like a gathering storm, and then leaned forward with the calm of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. Are you finished? She had asked. The moment that would echo across the nation, Crockett waited, just long enough to let the laughter and applause from her question fade. Then, in a voice neither raised nor hurried, she began. You see, the problem isn't that I don't understand how this works. The problem is that you think the way it works should never be challenged. You've mistaken experience for entitlement. And that's not leadership, it's arrogance. The line cut like a blade. The audience gasped audibly, the kind of gasp that signals recognition more than shock. It was as if Crockett had articulated something many had felt, but few had dared to say. Harris blinked, her smile faltering, her composure slipping like a mask cracking under heat. Crockett didn't stop there. She pressed on, her tone precise, her cadence deliberate, every word landing like a strike. Leadership isn't about talking down to people. It isn't about cutting them off because you're afraid of what they might say. It's about listening. It's about respect. And if you can't respect your opponent on this stage, then how can anyone trust you to respect the people you claim to serve? The crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, drowning out Harris's attempt to interject. Some in the front row stood to their feet, clapping, nodding, cheering. The cameras panned to audience members, wide-eyed, mouths open, whispering to their neighbors on social media. The explosion was instant. Within seconds, hashtags began trending. Hashtag Crockett Clapback, hashtag dignity over arrogance, hashtag are you finished? Clips of the moment flooded Twitter and TikTok. One tweet racked up thousands of retweets in minutes. Jasmine Crockett just body-checked Kamala with pure composure. This is how you win a debate. Memes sprang to life, Harris's faltering expression side by side with Crockett's unflinching gaze. Harris tried to recover, raising her voice, gesturing more forcefully, but the damage was done. The more she fought back, the more flustered she appeared. Crockett, by contrast, only grew steadier. Every rebuttal she offered was grounded in clarity, not performance. Every pause she allowed herself built anticipation rather than weakness. It was the classic reversal, the establishment figure unraveling while the underdog rose into the spotlight. Crockett continued, her words building into a crescendo. I'm not here to play politics as usual. I'm not here to trade sound bites. I'm here because people out there are struggling, and they're tired of being dismissed. They're tired of leaders who think power means talking over them. Power doesn't come from silencing voices. Power comes from amplifying them. The applause was deafening now. Even the moderators struggled to bring order back to the stage. Harris attempted a smile, a practice nod, but the cracks showed. Her eyes darted, her shoulders tightened, her voice strained as she attempted a rebuttal that landed flat. It was as if every ounce of her polish had evaporated in the face of Crockett's authenticity, and then came the knockout blow. The line that would be replayed on every network, clipped into every highlight reel, etched into the memory of everyone who watched. Crockett leaned back slightly, letting her voice drop just enough to draw the room closer. You can interrupt me 100 times, but you can't interrupt the truth. And the truth is simple. Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And tonight, the people watching know exactly who's earned it. The hall exploded. Yes. Whistles, applause that went on for nearly a full minute. The moderators tried to speak over it, but the sound was unstoppable. Harris sat frozen, her smile forced, her eyes betraying frustration she could no longer disguise. Online, the moment was already immortal. TikTok users looped Crockett's final line over dramatic music. Twitter was ablaze with quotes, reaction GIFs, and declarations that Crockett had ended the debate in one sentence. Instagram Reels compared the two women side by side, one rattled, one resolute. Commentators posted, "This is the moment Jasmine Crockett became a household name. It wasn't just a mic drop, it was a transformation that Crockett had walked onto the stage as the underestimated challenger and, in the span of a few minutes, redefined herself as the voice of authenticity." The audience in the hall had felt it. Millions watching at home had felt it. Even Harris herself, sitting silently, as the applause refused to die down, felt it. The duel was over. Crockett hadn't won by shouting louder or striking harder. She had won by embodying the very qualities Harris lacked: respect, composure, and truth. In doing so, she turned the debate into a referendum not on policies alone, but on character, on dignity, on what kind of leadership America was hungry for. And though the applause eventually faded, the moment did not. It lingered in the air, in the headlines already being drafted, in the viral clips racing across phones, in the whispers of a crowd that knew they had just witnessed history. This was no longer about a single debate night. This was about a shift. In power, a rewriting of expectations. A declaration that authenticity could topple arrogance in the most public of arenas. Crockett's gaze never wavered. She had delivered her strike with precision, not malice. She did not gloat. She did not smile smugly. She simply sat, calm and steady, as though she'd always known this moment was inevitable. Maybe because for her, it wasn't about the performance it was about the principle. And for Harris, no spin or rebuttal could undo what had just been witnessed by millions. She had been exposed, not by an opponent's aggression, but by her own unraveling in the face of dignity. The stage, once hers now, belonged to someone else, but if the room was shaken, the nation was about to erupt. Asterisk. The roar inside the debate hall was still echoing when the first clips hit social media. In seconds, Crockett's.com takedown of Kamala Harris was everywhere. Twitter threads lit up with all-caps reactions. She did that? This is how? You ended debate. Memes surfaced almost instantly, Harris frozen mid-expression. Crockett's steady gaze captioned with phrases like, "Respect isn't demanded.
It's earned."
The internet had crowned its victor before the moderators could even wrap up the segment. Hashtags began climbing the charts at lightning speed. Hashtag Rit. TikTok creators layered her line over beats, remixing it into dance videos, skits, even motivational edits. Teenagers who had never before cared about debates suddenly found themselves lip-syncing Crockett's words into their front-facing cameras. Instagram Reels flooded timelines with slow-motion replays of her mic drop, often paired with captions like, "When you stay calm and still win the room." On YouTube, commentators rushed to upload reaction videos. Titles screamed, "Crockett ends Harris's career on live TV," and the moment that changed everything. Each one replayed the knockout line, often in slow motion, followed by pundits leaning into microphones with the same incredulous tone. Did we just watch the underdog flip the entire debate? Celebrities, too, joined the chorus. A-list actors, musicians, and athletes tweeted their admiration. One wrote, "That line deserves a standing ovation in every household." Crockett didn't just debate, she represented, another posted simply. Respect earned. By dawn, her words had become more than a viral moment. They had become a cultural reference point. Shorthand for standing your ground with dignity. News outlets scrambled to catch up with the pace of the internet. The next morning's headlines read like a tidal wave. Crockett silences Harris with one line, "Respect over arrogance." The debate that changed the race, and a viral mic drop shakes the establishment. On cable news panels replayed, the clip over and over, dissecting every pause, every shift in Harris's face, every ripple in the audience reaction, and with every replay, the symbolism grew heavier. Commentators framed the moment not just as a debate highlight, but as a metaphor for the national mood. "This isn't about Crockett versus Harris," one analyst said. "This is about authenticity versus performance. About the country's hunger for leaders who listen rather than dismiss." For Harris, the fallout was brutal. Pundits who once praised her composure now described her as rattled, arrogant, even exposed. Editorials questioned her ability to connect with ordinary Americans, pointing out how her interruptions and dismissive tone backfired in real time. Meanwhile, Crockett was hailed as the new voice of dignity, the unlikely champion who had turned the tables without raising her voice. The ripple effects stretched beyond politics. Churches quoted Crockett's words from pulpits, weaving them into sermons about respect and humility. Community leaders invoked her as an example of grace under fire. Parents played the clip for their children, saying, "This is how you stand your ground without losing yourself." Everywhere you turned, her line had become a kind of anthem. On college campuses, students wore shirts emblazoned with "Respect is earned." Protesters at rallies carried signs quoting her words. Even late-night comedians built entire monologues around the moment, replaying Harris's faltering expression to laughter and applause. And yet, beneath the humor, there was a deeper current. The exchange had tapped into something raw, something about dignity, identity, and the right to be heard. Crockett's composure spoke not just for herself, but for countless people who had lived under the weight of condescension, who had been interrupted, dismissed, or underestimated. Her words gave them a rallying cry, a reminder that calm resolve could be more powerful than arrogance shouted from a podium. In the days that followed, Harris's campaign scrambled to reframe the narrative. Spokespeople insisted she had been passionate, that she had merely been asserting her record. But the damage was done. Clips of her outbursts lived on every screen, contrasted endlessly with Crockett's poise. In politics, perception is reality, and perception had shifted. By the end of the week, polls reflected the shockwaves. Crockett's favorability spiked, especially among younger voters and immigrant communities who felt seen in her words. Harris, by contrast, saw her support dip, her image tarnished by the perception of arrogance. It was more than a clash between two politicians, it was a cultural moment. A shift in how people measured strength. No longer was dominance defined by who could shout the loudest. It was defined by who could hold their ground with dignity. But what no one could have predicted was how this moment would redefine the conversation. Asterisk when the echoes of applause faded, and the headlines began to settle, what remained was something larger than a single debate. It wasn't about the clash of two politicians, or even the viral replay of one devastating line. It was about what the moment revealed: the stark contrast between arrogance and authenticity. Between performance and truth, Kamala Harris came to the stage armed with the tools of establishment politics: Polish dominance, and the certainty that her experience would insulate her from challenge. But those tools, sharpened for years, dulled under the weight of condescension. Audiences didn't see strength in her interruptions, they saw insecurity. They didn't hear conviction in her tone, they heard dismissal. For all her carefully crafted lines, what Harris forgot is that leadership is not about proving you are the loudest in the room. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, came armed with something else entirely. She carried the strength of her story. The calm of her resolve, and the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated before and had survived it. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to match arrogance with arrogance. Her power was in her restraint, her dignity, her ability to let truth speak louder than volume ever could. That's why the moment resonated far beyond the debate hall. Because everyone watching could recognize themselves in it. Who hasn't felt the sting of being interrupted, dismissed, or talked down to? Who hasn't been underestimated, told they were too small, too late, too different to matter? Crockett's response wasn't just her victory, it was validation for millions who have lived through the same dynamics in classrooms, in workplaces, in everyday conversations, and in that validation was a universal truth. Respect cannot be demanded by force. It must be earned through conduct, through listening, through humility. It is not something you seize with interruptions, it is something you build with presence. Crockett's words carried because they weren't only directed at Harris. Were directed at every person who has ever wondered if dignity could still matter in a world that rewards arrogance. This was more than politics. It was a reminder of the kind of leadership America is still capable of producing. A reminder that the soul of democracy does not rest in soundbites or theatrics, but in the character of those who serve. When Crockett said, "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn," she was speaking to a principle older than any party line, that real strength is measured not by how forcefully you speak, but by how faithfully you stand. And perhaps that is why the moment lingered long after the applause. It was more than a viral highlight, it was a mirror. A mirror held up to a nation struggling to decide what kind of voice it wants guiding its future. Do we follow arrogance, sharpened into performance, or do we follow dignity, grounded in truth? In America, voices that rise from the people steady, unshaken, unapologetical was carried further than those who try to shout them down. That is the heartbeat of this country, the force that has carried movements, redefined identities, and expanded the promise of freedom. Crockett's reply was not the end of a debate. It was a continuation of that legacy. In the end, the lesson is simple but powerful. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. Truth will always get cut. And no matter how polished the performance, authenticity will always ring louder. And on that night, in that room, before millions of witnesses, authenticity won. That night will be remembered not for the interruptions, not for the rehearsed talking points, but for one unforgettable exchange. The moment Kamala Harris lost her composure, and Jasmine Crockett, steady and unshaken, delivered the line that left a nation breathless. It wasn't just politics, it was dignity clashing with arrogance. And dignity winning in front of millions, because no matter how loud the noise, no matter how sharp the insults, truth delivered with calm resolve will always cut deeper. Crockett proved that respect is not seized, it is earned. And in that instant, she became more than a debater. She became a symbol of what it means to stand tall when others try to diminish you. That's why this moment matters. Because it's not just about who won a debate, it's about what kind of leadership we want to see, what kind of values we want to elevate, and what kind of example we want to carry forward. So if you believe like we do, that dignity should always triumph over arrogance, make your voice heard. Share this story. Keep this moment alive. Let it be a reminder in every classroom, every workplace, every community, that calm resolve can silence arrogance.
And that authenticity will always resonate more than performance. And if you want more stories like this, stories that uncover
the drama, the lessons, and the inspiration behind the headlines, hit subscribe. Turn on notifications and join this movement. Because every time you share, every time you engage, you help amplify the truth that dignity still matters, and that the voices of the people cannot be silenced. This was more than a debate. This was a reminder of who we are. And the conversation has only just begun.